Okay, so greetings to everybody. Can I just have a wave or something so I know I'm being heard? Okay, thank you very much. First of all, thank you to Ariel in Cape Town who's making this happen technically, and thank you to my daughter Bina who runs the back end of the website and everyone who helps me. Also, special thank you to people who have made donations at my website. Very much appreciated, as you all know. I've never requested that, but it keeps us going. So they're very much appreciated. I'm actually always moved by people who send in donations. Often people send in small amounts or people send in small amounts every month, but enough to keep us going. So very much appreciated. I'm not going to greet people individually because I'll definitely miss someone, and also because a lot of people I can only see a black box. So, um, but I assume that if I'm not seeing you, I assume that you are hearing me. Let's turn our attention to Pesach and see if we can lay down something a little bit new, a little bit deeper. We spoke last year, those of you who remember, we spoke about why Pesach is fundamental, why it's the point of origin for all of Judaism and Torah, even though you might think that the giving of the Torah is more significant, and yet it's the Exodus on which everything is based. The year before that, if you recall, I think we spoke about speech. The idea is that in Egypt, speech was in exile, right? Paroi, Pharaoh, is Pera, bad mouth. Pesach, the mouth talks. Haggadah, talking. The month of Nisan is the month of speech, etc. And we spoke about that. Let's see if we can turn our attention to something we have not discussed, and that is something deep in the essence of time itself. This connects also to 4 cups of wine and to the female dimension. I'm not sure we'll have time to work it all out, but I'll try to lay down the core principles. And if I don't have time to tie it all together, you'll have some work to do, and I hope you'll find that productive. 4 cups of wine, incidentally, before we even begin, are connected to the 4 mothers, right? That should be pretty obvious. Everyone should know that the 3 matzahs are connected to the 3 fathers, right? Avraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, that's quite clear. What many people don't know is that the 4 cups of wine are connected to Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah. When you hear 3 and 4 going like that, it should always set off in your mind the balance between the 3 fathers and the 4 mothers. Why there need to be 3 fathers and 4 mothers is something I don't propose to go into now. But that is fundamental. For those who'd like to look it up, there's a long section on that in the Leshem, in Sefer Adar. Actually, I think it's in Sefer Hagdomas Hasharim, where he goes through that. An easy way to find references in the Leshem, by the way, is simply look in Shirei Leshem, where you'll find all the topics laid out very clearly. But the 4 cups of wine correspond to the 4 mothers. In fact, the Shloh points out that the first cup is Sarah. What is that? What's the correspondence? Sarah is the one who begins the path of Kedusha, sanctity in the world. She's the one who converts, so to speak, the women. Avram, her husband, brings the men in, and she brings in the women. I see I'm getting a few questions on the screen as well. There is a 5th cup, but we don't drink it. And that is a step beyond. So let's not get into that at the moment. But maybe you could even hold the questions because, yeah, I'm getting bombarded with questions and comments. I'm not going to be able to deal with all the questions as we go. So let me ask you to put those aside unless something's not clear. If there's time at the end, perhaps we'll try to take some questions if I can. But the first of the cups is Kiddush, and that, of course, is the Kiddush or Kedusha that Sarah made. The second is Rivka, and that is the cup on the telling, right? The telling of the Haggadah. And you know, of course, Rivka is the one who is coming from a background of a contaminated background and becomes pure despite her background from the family she comes from. And that is, of course, the mitzvah of the Haggadah, which to start with the denigrating or the lowly aspects of the Jewish people's background and their development into sanctity, right? So that's the parallel. The 3rd cup, of course, is Rachel, and that is the cup of the benching, right? The benching, there's so many connections with that. Rachel, of course, is the mother of Yosef, who's the one who provides food for the Jewish people. That's one connection. So that's the element of connection of the food and the thanks for the food, which is Yosef. That's one of the connections. And of course, Leah is the one who teaches us Hoda, right? Thanks. She's the one who says she gives birth to Yehuda, and she's Modeh. And that's, of course, what Hallel v'Hoda is. And the fourth cup is said over the Hallel. So there are clear connections to the four mothers as we go through the 4 cups of wine. This needs to be deeply understood because wine we know is Midas Hadin, right? The bread, the matzah is Chesed, and the wine is Din. The women, the female side is the side of Din, and that will need explanation. So with that theme in the background, let's turn our attention to the female dimension of time and see a theme deep in the essence of what Pesach is, which is the conquest of time. Perhaps that should be the name of the theme, is the conquest of time. Let me try to explain what I mean and build it in layers, and hopefully you'll gain something new and something you can think about and maybe share at the Seder, something I hope you'll find stimulating. You all know that we left Egypt rapidly. The Torah says b'chipazon. Chipazon means rapidly. And of course, everybody knows, it's basic, it's fundamental that we left Egypt rapidly. The most obvious sign of that is that the matzah had no time to rise. That fateful cosmic midnight when the Jewish people, amidst the destruction of the Egyptian firstborn, where we became, so to speak, the firstborn, we exit Egypt in a rapid process. So rapid that the dough doesn't have time to rise. And there was no rush in terms of danger. Egypt was completely laid low at that point, concerned with every home in which a firstborn had died, after 10 plagues that had decimated the whole of Egyptian society. There was no fear, there was no rush because of a fear of being, of in some way being in danger. But the exodus was so rapid, there wasn't even time to let the dough rise. And of course, that's the concept of matzah. It is the water in the flour, which is baked so rapidly that there's no time for the fermentation to take place. So the exodus from Egypt was extremely rapid. If you want to give it numbers, 18 minutes, you know that from the moment the water hits the dough, the water hits the flour, or more technically, correctly, from the moment the water hits the flour and is given time to ferment. As long as you're moving it, that might make a difference. But basically, from when the mixture occurs in the water, if you've ever been in a matzah factory, you'll see this timer begins as soon as the water is added to the flour. And then the matzah needs to be baked within 18 minutes. 18, of course, is chai. That is the share of being alive. And so that is the rapidity with which the Jewish people left Egypt. Now that raises a question. And the question is, what's the rush? What's the rush? Why do they need to leave rapidly? Couldn't take their time, take their food with them? You're not talking about taking weeks or months, you're talking about minutes. 20 minutes would have been too much. What's the big rush at that point? You're moving in millions of people, a whole nation, into the desert, It has to be that rapid. So there's a famous comment attributed to the Arizal. To tell you the truth, it's not clear where he said this. Best of my knowledge, it's not recorded in his original writings or those who wrote down firsthand what he said. But it's quoted throughout the generations, and many of our great authorities quote this. So, although we don't know exactly in which context he said it, we don't have it recorded in one of the books that record his teachings, but nevertheless, it's very well known that the Arizal, you're going back to the late 1500s, he died in 1574, the great Kabbalistic expositor of the Zohar, the luminary in all those centuries who gave us everything we have today in terms of interpretation of Kabbalah. The Arizal said that the reason we needed to leave rapidly was because we'd reached the 49th level of impurity. Any longer, we would have sunk into the 50th level, and that's the point of no return. In other words, we reached the critical moment of the point of no return. Had we not left rapidly, we would have sunk into the point of permanent contamination, disintegrated, decomposed, and there would have been no recourse. And therefore, at the very last minute, and we mean literally the last minute, we mean the last 20 minutes, 18 minutes, the Jewish people needed to leave, and that's why we needed to leave rapidly. That is what he says. Before we raise the question on this, the famous question raised by the Leshem, again, great Kabbalist, died about 100 years ago, the father of Rav Elyashiv, raises an astounding question on this comment of the Arizal. An astounding question, has an incredibly original answer. But before I tell you his question, let's just understand a bit more deeply what the Arizal is teaching us. What does it mean to reach the point of no return, the 49th level of contamination? I'm sure you're all aware that the tikkun for that, the correction for the 49 levels of impurity, were the 49 days in the desert, right? That should be clear. We reached the 49th level of descent, and so there was a corresponding 49 days of ascent, which brings us to the giving of the Torah. Zelu matzeh, this against that. For every level of contamination, there needed to be a level of ascent. And that's why there were 49 days from the low point to the high point at the receiving of the Torah. What does it mean to be on the 49th level and not reach the 50th? Notice that when we count the 50 days from Pesach to Shavuot, Pesach to Shavuos, we don't count the 50th day. We count 49 days, and the 50th we leave unsaid, even though the Torah says quite explicitly, Tisperu Chamishim Yom, you shall count 50 days. The Torah is quite clear that we are commanded to count 50 days, and the Jewish people count 49 days. The 50th day is Shavuos, we get up, we take a cup of wine, we make Kiddush, but we don't say it's the 50th day. If the Torah commands us to count 50 days, why don't we do it? This is a long discussion in its own right. Maybe during the counting of the Omer we'll have time to talk about it. But the essential idea is that the 50th is not a number. The 50th is the transcendence. The 50th is what moves beyond the numbers. If you like an analogy, music is made by playing notes. And for argument's sake, we can talk about the 7-note scale that we use in conventional Western music. The 7 notes that we use combine to make something called music. Music's not an 8th note. It's the totality of the 7th. It's the point. And yet, you can't put your finger on it. It's not an extra note. The 49th day is the totality of the 49 levels of growth. The 50th is the result. It's not another step. My friends, the destination is not one more step in the journey. The destination is the totality and the purpose of the journey. The music is not one more note. The music is the experience of the totality of the notes. If you gave it a number, you'd be killing it. If you gave it a number, you'd be reducing it to just one more step. The music is not one more note in the symphony. The music is when all the 7 notes come together correctly, something happens that's called the 8th. We count the 50th day by not counting it. By not giving it a number, we allow it to express itself and to hear the music. And therefore, of course, we count 50 days. The meaning of counting 50 is to count 49 so perfectly that the music emerges. In modern science, they call this an emergent phenomenon, something that emerges from the parts in which the sum of the parts is greater than the individual parts. And therefore, here's the message. This is a long theme, and I'm not going to develop it now. But the key to understand is that the 50th is not another detail. It's the totality and summation of all the details, paradoxically and amazingly being constructed from the details themselves. All the music is the notes. There's nothing else there besides the notes. And yet, in their confluence, something happens that By the way, as an important aside, the only way you will ever see God, the only way you will ever experience Hashem in the world is through the details of the world. The only way you will ever experience Hashem is by the detailed words and concepts in the Torah that as you study them. You will never, if God taps you on the shoulder personally and explicitly, you need to see a therapist. Right? That's not the way God speaks to you. The way He speaks to you is by you're putting the details together, and then the music is heard, just as surely as the beauty of a symphony is heard, even though you cannot express it as one more note. Now, what I want to extract from that is this. On the 49 levels of descent into spiritual annihilation, the 50th is not one more step. The 50th is beyond the point of no return. Just as the 50th in the levels of ascent transcends the details and becomes another world entirely, the 50th on the way down transcends the details and represents utter disappearance. That's why there's a fascinating Kabbalistic argument about whether there are 49 levels of contamination or 50. These types of arguments, obviously, both sides must be true. Well, on the one hand, of course, there's a 50th level of contamination. You can certainly take that fateful step into the 50th. But on the other hand, it's not a step. When you take that step, you haven't stepped one more step down. You've disintegrated. You've disappeared. No point. Right? You can put this also very beautifully. The Maharal comes to mind here. The Maharal says that tshuva, which is the return from contamination, right, from a sinful state back to purity, the word tshuva, says the Maharal, is based on the root shav. Shav. And the Maharal points out in his classical fashion that shav is the second last letter of the Hebrew alphabet and the second letter, right? It's not the last to the first. Tshuva doesn't take you from the end back to the beginning. It takes you from almost the end to almost the beginning. The second last letter, the shin, to the base, which is the second letter. And the Maharal asks, why? Why does tshuva not take you all the way back? And he answers, because if you've gone all the way, there's nothing left to reconstruct. If you've totally disintegrated, there's nothing left at all. And on the contrary, if you haven't left a point of origin, some Jewish spark, some spiritual potential, then there's nothing to talk about. In other words, there are points of no return. And so the 50th level of contamination, or Egyptian sinking into Egyptian culture and materialism, right? That is the point of no return. And therefore the Jewish people, to sum up, had reached the point of no return, the 49th level of spiritual contamination. And one more moment in Egypt, a few more minutes, would have represented total and utter permanent destruction, and we needed to leave rapidly. So rapidly that we couldn't afford even a few more minutes, because we had reached the ultimate borderline of spiritual darkness. So far, so good. Now, I hope that's clear to everyone. Maybe you can give me a nod. Okay. Now, here comes the question of the Baal HaLeshem, right? The Baal HaLeshem, again, the famous teacher. He says this. Again, follow me carefully, please. It's critical to understand the question. The question is, what do you mean to tell me that on that incredible, fateful midnight, when the Egyptians were finally destroyed completely, the firstborn destroyed completely, finally the message of all the 10 plagues had come home, and there was nothing left of Egypt. In fact, Egypt wasn't heard from for 500 years after that, right? They managed to scrape together a last-ditch attempt to chase the Jews at the sea 7 days later, but effectively Egypt had been destroyed. Do you mean to tell me that a few more minutes in that context of Jewish triumph and Egyptian destruction would have caused our disappearance? What are you saying? Here's the notion. The notion is we reached the point of no return in Egypt to the minute, which means we're talking literally about that final midnight. Is it conceivable that on that final midnight, a few more minutes in Egypt would have killed us? It was triumphant. It was a spiritual voltage that was unprecedented. You're not talking about another few minutes of slavery and Egyptian cultural domination. I'm not sure I'm getting through. Let me make a little graph for you to illustrate this as clearly as I can. Imagine the Jewish people going to Egypt, and they start descending over hundreds of years of slavery. To be specific, 210 years. In fact, it should have been 400 years. But after 210 years, they reached the point of no return, and that's why the process of redemption needed to begin then. So if you tell me that they spent 210 years steadily going down, and after 210 years, they reached a point of no return, and that's why the redemption needed to begin, I understand. But that's not the correct diagram. The correct diagram is the Jewish people go down, and then the plagues begin, and they begin going up. A year before the plagues had begun. The plagues didn't start the day before the Exodus. There'd been a year of no slavery. There'd been a year of plague after plague, each one a spiritual ascent, a crescendo experience of spirituality. The first of the plagues, when the river became blood, was a watershed moment where Egypt suddenly realized that they were in danger, and the Jewish people began to smell the upcoming redemption. And the second plague and the third, do you know that the plagues in Egypt were not simply a list of events? They were an escalation in crescendo fashion. You know that the Maharal famously points out, and others point this out too, that the plagues in Egypt proceeded in reverse order of the statements of creation. You know, it's a beautiful idea, this, and you can share it at your Seder. You know that the world is created in 10 statements, right? First of all, in the beginning, that's a dimensionless point of origin. Then there's a sense of revelation, let there be light. 10 layers create the world. Why were there 10 plagues in Egypt? Why 10? The answer is because the Egyptians had made so toxic, they had so contaminated and perverted all 10 layers of reality that the layers needed to peel away from the outside in. You start with an infinite point and you layer 10 layers of reality. When you want to purify such a structure, you peel the layers away from the outside until you finally get back to a pure center. And that's why the 10 plagues in Egypt needed to be 10, each of them to decontaminate, detoxify a level of spirit that the Egyptians had contaminated. And so they proceeded in reverse order to undo the process. Think about it. What was the first statement of creation? Bereshis, in the beginning. What was the last of the plagues? Destruction of the firstborn, the wrong sort of contaminated beginning. What is the second of the statements of creation? Was let there be light. What is the second last of the plagues? The plague of darkness, extinguishing. You see, it's an amazing process. I'm not going to go through them now. You can find this in the Maharal, in the Shlomo, Rabbi Kagan's book. He details these. A very interesting exercise to go through the reversal of the process. But the point we can extract from that is that when you get to that unbelievable midnight, you've reached back to the moment of creation. You've reached back to a moment where there's nothing other than gracious. You know, obviously the 10 commandments parallel the same 10. What is the first of the 10 commandments? I am. Just a statement of Hashem's raw essence. And by the way, that's why we say in the Haggadah that on the night of the firstborn destruction, what does it say in the Haggadah? Ani v'lo malach, ani v'lo saraf, ani v'lo shliach. God says, I alone. No agency, no intermediary, no angel. Not like the other plagues, because you've reached back to that moment of origin, which obviously corresponds to the first of the 10 commandments, I am. And of course, if you have a brain in your head, you realize that all the 10s in the Torah are following the same pattern. What is the 10th of Abraham's tests? Having to kill his firstborn. Again, returning to life and death of a firstborn. You see the pattern repeats itself many, many times in Torah. But in that fateful midnight, when the firstborn were destroyed, you've reached back to the moment of creation, where Hashem himself appears in Egypt. That was a voltage that was unprecedented. That was a sanctity and a kedusha that was indescribable. You mean to tell me a few more minutes of that, the Jewish people would disappear in Egyptian contamination? What are you saying? If the question's clear, could you please raise your hand? I don't want to labor the question more than necessary. We get the question? Okay. Don't have to, yeah, okay. So let's try to understand this. This is the question that the Leshem raises. How could the Arizal have said, and all our greats quote him through the centuries, that had the Jewish people remained in Egypt a few more minutes at that midnight, they would have disappeared in Egyptian contamination. Nothing could have been better than a few more minutes of that sense of that dimension of revelation. Now, the Leshem gives an answer which is amazingly stimulating and very thought-provoking. I don't want to belabor that. I'll mention it just for completion and for interest, and you can think about this. Something that needs extensive discussion. But I want to mention it in passing. I want to get to a different answer, which is the Maharal's answer, which Rav Hutner works out in Pachad Yitzchak. But in deference to the Leshem, was Yortzeit was last week, by the way, 27th of Adar. Let me mention what the Leshem says, without attempting to explain it. The Leshem says that the problem with those last few minutes in Egypt is not that we would have sank in Egyptian contamination because things were too low. Things were too high. That's what he says. We would have exploded. A few more minutes in Egypt wouldn't have yielded Egyptian contamination and sinking on the way down. We would have exploded on the way up. A few more minutes of that voltage, we would have burned out. You know, the Maharal says something like this, amazing idea, and that in one of his droshes, the Maharal says, why is it that when a person touches a dead body, they become contaminated? Well, when you touch a dead body, you become tameh, you become spiritually impure. People usually think it's because the dead contaminate. Maharal says something astounding. He says a person who's died is in a dimension so high at this point that when you come into contact with that, it destroys you. That means the discrepancy between where that person is now, right, and your contact with that, when you come into contact with something too high for you, the discrepancy knocks you back and has that effect on you. In other words, the Jewish people experiencing that voltage, not yet ready, without the 50 days of preparation that would enable them to stand at Sinai and be able to stand that revelation in some way, they were not ready for that. And therefore, says the Leshem, the reason that Jews needed to leave Egypt first is not because things were too low, things were too high. The heat, the voltage, millions of volts spiritually, was too much. And therefore, the danger was disappearing, not because of the lowliness of Egyptian culture, but because of the spiritual intensity. Okay, that needs thought, and that is something I'm not going to go into now. Let me share with you the Maharal's approach to this, which is an amazing life lesson. Will take us back to the Four Cups, I hope, and will solve a number of questions in Jewish character building and Jewish ideology. And if you'd like to look it up, there's a wonderful exposition of this in the very beginning of Pachad Yitzchak on Pesach, where I've put this elegant exposition of this subject with the textual proofs, but I'll try to convey the basic idea. And what the Maharal tells us is that the problem of a few more minutes in Egypt, of more time in Egypt, would not have been spiritual contamination. There was no threat from Egyptian culture and the persecution and the rubbing off on us of Egyptian immorality and spiritual darkness. The problem with more time in Egypt would have been more time. In other words, had we been born in a moment of expanded time, let's call it laziness, let's call it using time more than necessary, we would have been born as a people living in time, not a people transcending time. Let me try to explain this as best I can. The context that we find ourselves in is the context of space and time. We live in a world of space and time. There are only three dimensions to the world: space, time, and soul. Those are the three dimensions, what we call Ashan. Right? The mountain was completely smoke, Ashan. Olam, Shona, Nefesh. Olam, what we call space, Shona, what we call time, and Nefesh, the world of spirit or soul, which is neither space nor time. That says it all, right? In modern science, they talk about space-time. The Maharal talks about space-time. And we inhabit space-time. Now, the context we have is space and time. Here's the message. Here's the key. This is the take-home message, and I'll try to explain it. If you use space or time more than necessary, you become a child of space and time. If you use space or time more than necessary, you expand into space or time, then you become a part of the world of the dimensions of space and time. If you want to be a transcendent being, you want to be spiritual, you need to rise beyond the boundaries of space and time. Now, how do you do that? Well, you need to use some space and time. You are a creature in the physical world. You inhabit the dimensions of space and time. But the secret is, and again, this is the take-home message, the spiritual path involves using space and time only as much as necessary. As soon as you can't use less than necessary. Otherwise, you make a mess if you rush. Right? You can't eat less than you need. You can't sleep less than you need. Otherwise, you destroy yourself. But more, you expand into the world of sensuality and laziness and physicality and the material, and then you become a victim of that. Let's go through this and see if we can understand it. First of all, Egyptian contamination is precisely the world of sensuality and the material. The whole point about Egypt is that it is a constraint limited to the material. You all know, I'm sure, that the word Mitzrayim itself means to be straightened. When I say straight, I mean S-T-R-A-I-T, like a straitjacket. Mitzrayim is the word Meitzarim, which means to be hemmed in, right? That is exactly the world of the 49. We move out into the 50th, which transcends space and time. But Egypt means the one that, right? You can compute the gematria of the word mispar, which means number, right? And you'll see it's the same as Mitzrayim. Is that right? Someone's going to work it out while I'm talking. So the concept of Egypt, of Mitzrayim, right, is that which constrains and holds in spiritual expression. Last year we spoke about, the year before we spoke about Egypt being the galus of Dibur. Dibur means to express yourself. And in Egypt there's no ability to express yourself. That's why Moshe cannot speak. Moshe, our great, ironically, our spokesman, cannot speak because Egypt constrains the expression of self. And therefore, Egypt is the world of contamination, sensuality, using the material for its own sake. And the Exodus is a process of leaving that, as I tried to explain last year, and I'm sure you all remember. We analyzed the Rambam, who tells us that the mitzvah of the Pesach Seder is not to talk about the Exodus, but to talk about the miracles. Astounding. The words of the Rambam are, mitzvahs eseh shel Torah. It is a positive commandment of the Torah. L'saper, to tell, not about the Exodus, but nisim v'niflos, about the miracles and wonders that occurred to our forefathers on this night. Amazing. What about the Exodus? The Exodus is not the important point. The important point is not leaving one country and moving to another, one culture and moving to another, slavery and moving to freedom. The important part is leaving the natural and blowing out into the supernatural. That's the important point. If your child gets up from the Seder thinking this is a geopolitical story, we went from one place to another, we went from slavery to freedom, they're missing the point big time. The point is that we exited the material into the supernatural. That's the important point. And the Rambam rules that the important thing to talk about on the Seder is not the Exodus, but the miraculous. That's what he says. You know when he mentions the Exodus, says the Rambam? When you have a child who is so small that he cannot understand anything else, then you tell him, my child, we were slaves and we were freed. But if the child is wise, says the Rambam, talking about the Ben Chacham, you say, my child, on this night we experienced miracles. The point about Egypt is the blowing out from the natural into the supernatural. And how do you do that? Once again, you can only hear the music through the notes. You can only hear the music through the notes. You need to use the notes. The point of the exercise is not the notes. The point of the exercise is the music, but you only do it through the notes. You can only become spiritual through the world. The point is not the world. If the point for you is the world, you're an unspiritual individual. But you can only become spiritual through the world. You need a body. You can only do a spiritual thing like have a child if you have a body. You can only have a spiritual experience if you have a body to host your soul, to give it what it needs and to give it the substrate and to be its chariot that carries it through life. And therefore, that leads us to the concept of the Exodus. And the Maharal explains that we needed to leave Egypt rapidly because had we left languid, in a languid form, laid back, slowly, we would have become born as children of time. And forever we would have been a natural people inhabiting the natural world. The secret was to use time and space minimally, not zero, but to use it as a springboard and a substrate for the spiritual. And the formula to do that is to use it exactly as much as necessary, not 1 minute more and not one mouthful more. Now, let's work this out and see how far this goes. Think about the mitzvah of Pesach. We'll come to the wine and understand how that fits in as well. But let's start with the mitzvah of Pesach, which is the matzah. I'm sure you all know that when the Torah says, Ushmartem es hamatzos, and you shall guard the matzahs, Chazal read it as, and you shall guard the mitzvahs. In Hebrew, spelled exactly the same way. What does it mean, say Chazal? Just like you should not let the matzah become chometz, do not let a mitzvah become chometz. You know what that means? Matzah needs to be flour and water baked immediately. A mitzvah needs to be done rapidly. Because as soon as the mitzvah is done in a languid, sensual, lazy fashion, it becomes an action within the world. What is matzah? We'll get there. Hila, that's where we're heading. Stay tuned. The matzah is only the material that is necessary. What is matzah? Matzah is exactly what you see is what you get. Minimum ingredient, only the flour and the water, and only enough time. 1 minute more, matzah becomes chometz. It transforms from a mitzvah, which is serving Hashem and gaining you a share in the world to come, to one of the worst prohibitions in the Torah, which is chometz, which is called koros, spiritual excision. And the only difference is a minute of time. The Zohar points out that the word matzah and the word chametz are the same letters exactly. The only difference is that the he of matzah becomes a chet of chametz, just one drop of ink. That's all. All you have with a matzah, right, is that it's allowed a minute extra and starts to ferment, then it starts to expand beyond its borders and make much of itself and appear to be more than simply what you see is what you get. And therefore the concept of matzah is nothing other than the essence of the material itself. Not nothing. It's a food. It's a reality. It has material dimensions, but it's only the minimal material and it's only the minimal amount of time. And therefore, Pesach is all about using space and time minimally. We sustain ourselves with a food that is absolutely minimal. Nothing extra in there. Exactly what it is, not a drop of expansion, right? Beyond the mere, and not a moment more than the time that is necessary. We left Egypt rapidly because more time in Egypt, the problem would have been more time. The problem was not Egyptian. The reason we would have sunk into Egyptian contamination is because what Egypt represents is the world of space and time and luxury and all the pleasures you can imagine, whether they legitimate or illegitimate. The point is exiting that. And the way you do that is to use the material world, but only as much as needed. Let's take the next step. So far, so good. Is the point clear? Let's take the next step. The process of living as a Jew in the world is to use the material, not to abjure and reject the material. You are required to use the material. You are required to drink wine. We'll come to the wine in more detail. You're required to enjoy the sensuality of the world. You all probably know that a Nazir, somebody who rejects wine for a certain amount of time, right, as an effort to transcend and move into has to bring a sacrifice at the end of that period for not enjoying wine for a certain amount of time. As a Jew, you are required, and this is where we are uniquely different than almost every spiritual pathway you can think of. The common idea in spirituality is that in order to become holy, you need to exit the world. If you're a Christian and you want to become holy, you have to become a monk or a nun. Christianity is fraught with guilt about sensuality. If you are a Muslim, you're not allowed to own alcohol, never mind drink wine. You may not even own alcohol. And there are many sects and cults in the world that take it to an extreme. If you're a Mormon, I had a Mormon friend when I was a teenager, not allowed to drink coffee, not allowed to drink tea, never mind alcohol. Who knows what you might do if you drink a cup of coffee. Stimulants, you're stimulating the material, and they're not wrong. It's dangerous. As soon as you start stimulating the sensual, you're on a path to destruction. Not wrong about that. They're not idiots. We agree with that. We do Yom Kippur practicing how to transcend the material. But the ultimate point of Judaism is not to leave the material behind. It's to unify the material and the spiritual. What is unique about us, and utterly different from the rest of the world, is that we engage the danger of the material in order to elevate it to the spiritual. And the reason is because we are fixated and obsessed with the theme of oneness. The Gemara says that Avram came upon a world that was torn apart. You know what the Medrash says? That Abraham, Avram Avinu, who began the process, he's called Achais Lanu Katana. The Medrash says, we have a young sister. We have a young sister, Shir Hashirim. Who's our young sister? Avram. Why is he? Because She'iches Hakara, it's a play on words. Iche, that means he stitched together a torn world. The word achot in Hebrew, sister or brother, that root in Hebrew, la'ache, means to stitch together something torn. Brothers or sisters or brother and sister are two people from a common origin. They stitched together at some point. They share a common origin. By the way, this is why in Torah ideology, as Avram and Sarah teach, a man should think of his wife as his sister. Why? And let me remind you that the original marriages in the world were brother and sister. The Gemara calls it Olam Chesed Yiboneh. Adam and Eve's children married each other. They were brother and sister. That was ideal in that generation. Because husband and wife are two people who share a common origin. In the spiritual world, they fused at the back, torn apart and brought into the world to marry and face each other and form a relationship. So brother and sister are people with a common origin in this world, and husband and wife are people with a common origin seeking to fuse. And therefore, Avram was called our young sister. Why? He came across a torn world, meaning a world in which body and soul were once united. But after the sin of Adam, when sensuality became dominant, there became a war between the material and the spiritual. And he saw his role not like the people that he found walking the earth who were great spiritual masters of the time, Shem and Aver, and people in the Far East. The Medrash tells us about them. They were living on mountaintops in an ascetic and celibate fashion. They were transcending the world. And he said, that's fine and well, but you'll never reunite the parts of a broken world that way. And they said to him, if you try to engage the material, it will bring you down. And he said, we will engage the material and lift it up. Is it dangerous? It is, but that's Jewish path. And that is what he introduced to the world. He did not introduce to the world the idea of spirituality. There were great spiritual people teaching spiritual stuff long before him. Long before Shem and Aver were teaching Torah before he walked the world. He was alive, right, when Noah walked the earth. Right? But they were teaching that the resolution of the problem of sensuality and materialism is to reject it and transcend it. And he said we will never reunite a broken world that way. And therefore what he foisted on the world, what he brought to the world, was not spirituality. What he brought to the world was mitzvahs. The word mitzvah in Hebrew does not mean a commandment. Tzivui is a command. Mitzvah means a commandment that unifies. Saftachada means one bond. Mitzvah is a physical action. Of all 613 mitzvahs, virtually every one is a material, physical action. And the reason is you're using the body in service of the spirit. And therefore our pathway is not to reject the material world. Our pathway obliges us to eat food and drink wine and enjoy all the sensuality of the world, but only as much as is needed for spirit. That's the secret. And that's where the wine comes in. What is wine? Why do we take a cup of wine in Jewish living? Cup of wine, a marriage, a circumcision, we always take it. Shabbos, we're taking wine. Why? Why wine? The secret of wine, Rav Moshe Shapiro put it like this: wine symbolizes the yichidius of the Jewish people, the yichidiyut of the uniqueness of the Jewish people. That's what wine represents. Let me explain. The classic phrasing of this in the Gemara is Nichnas yain yatsa sod. When wine enters, the secret is revealed. I mean, the simplistic meaning of that is when you drink too much wine, you tell your secrets. Chazal are telling you something that you didn't know, not something that everybody knows. Nichnas yain yatsa sod. Yain is 70 in Hebrew. Sod is 70. Wine releases the spiritual, while wine brings to revelation the spiritual. But the problem with wine is that you need just enough. If you have too much, you become part of the scenery. That's the problem with wine. And that's the non-Jewish problem with wine. If you look in the non-Jewish world, you will find they either absolute total abstinence, right? Think prohibition, or they are indulging. I saw a report in an American medical journal some time ago. They took an inner city hospital in Boston. They investigated how many admissions to that hospital alcohol related. 50%. 50% in liver disease, esophageal disease, brain disease, trauma, violence. The non-Jewish world has a problem with alcohol. What could say it better than this? In most non-Jewish jurisdictions, you have to be 18 or even 21 to buy a beer. If you live in New York State, okay, you can have your sexual organs cut off if you want. You can be a teenager and go through sex change surgery, but you can't buy a beer till you're 21, right? Yeah, because the idea, alcohol. And in Judaism, kid's 8 days old. We're putting wine in his mouth. We have no problem with alcohol, right? And in classic Jewish living, we never had a problem with alcoholism. The reason is that that wine symbolizes exactly, the Gaon of Vilna puts it beautifully. The Gaon says that wine is a symbol of the spiritual. You know why? Because all things in the material world become worse with time. Spiritual things become better with time. Maturity, wisdom, judgment. You learn more and more as time goes by. Material things always get worse with time. Mechanical systems, biological systems, all material things get worse with time, except wine. It gets better with time. It's a window of insight in a physical substance that targets it's at the boundary of the material and the material and the spiritual. And therefore, as Jews, every time we bridge the gap between physical and spiritual, we take a cup of wine. What is circumcision? You're taking the most potentially sordid of all human activities and we giving it sanctity, wine. You're taking marriage, where two people will be involved in a relationship that involves a physical relationship that in the culture of the world is a subject of vulgarity, and we call it Kiddushin. We take wine. Shabbos, when the mundane of the week transcends into the Kedusha of Shabbos, we take wine. Havdalah is exactly the same thing, where the week descends for an ascent to a future Shabbos. But any time we're putting together the material and the spiritual, the uniqueness of the Jewish people, which is to marry together the two, we take wine. And that's the mothers. That's the four mothers of the Jewish people representing the material, right? The husband, the father, always represents the bringing down from the spiritual world. The woman represents the birth in the world, right? The expansion into the world of the material. And that's why wine is din. And that's why ladies are drinking Kiddush wine, but not Havdalah wine, right? That's the basis. And so the secret of the wine, it's the female dimension, and is that dimension of the material which it dangerously threatens if overused, to bring you into the material, but used correctly is the perfect agent to bridge the gap between the two. And therefore, the message of Pesach is that we use the material fully, but not a drop more than needed. Let me finish maybe with just one more illustration of the same point. After all, this is the birth of the Jewish people. This has to define us. This is the moment we explode into being. And therefore, this is a moment where we become what defines us. And who are we? We're a people that live fully in the material world. We eat and drink and we enjoy all the sensuality, but we use it only in service of the Spirit. And then it becomes sanctified as well. We don't abjure it and deny it and transcend it and don't use it at all. Absolutely not. We unify the world, but we don't use it more than necessary either. And Pesach is exactly that. The food that is minimal, exactly what it is and no more. The wine which is exactly on the border of liberating the spiritual and no more. The moment of alacrity that we leave Egypt, not using any more time than necessary. That's called zrizus. Zrizus means zealousness and alacrity, not rushing. We're not talking about rushing. You don't want your brain surgeon to rush, but you don't want him to take his time either. You want it to be done right. And that is using the material exactly as necessary. Let me give you one more illustration, and perhaps we'll stop with that. You know that the basis of our religion is using the material in service of the spiritual. Not that we've tried to talk about it in this session. Wherever you touch Torah, you'll see that we are required to enjoy the beauty of the world and the flavors. Do you know what says it better than this? Unbelievable. There's a Gemara in Chulin that goes through every forbidden pleasure and how you can experience them. Can you imagine that? The Gemara lists every forbidden pleasure and how you can experience it. You want to taste blood? There's a kosher way to taste blood. It happens to be by grilling liver correctly. You want to taste the taste of milk and meat together? There's a kosher way to do it. You know what's the kosher way to taste milk and meat together? If you correctly prepare the udder of a cow, it has the flavor and it's kosher. Unbelievable. The Gemara goes through every sensual pleasure that's forbidden and gives you a kosher version so you can experience it. What is this? This is Talmud. Talmud is about how to be spiritual in the world, not about how to enjoy the sensual forbidden pleasures. The answer is they were meant to be used, not supposed to reject any pleasure in the world. The world is not about, Judas is not about rejecting pleasure. It's using it correctly. And you'll be held accountable. When you leave this world, God's going to hold you accountable for not enjoying his world, because your job was to unify the sensuality and the material with the spiritual. That's our work. So here comes the problem, and I'll finish with this. The problem is any book you read of Jewish Mussar, which means character building and personality training, whatever you want to call it, they all have sections on precious. Precious means asceticism, detachment. Look in Mesilas Yesharim, right? The classic work of Jewish character building. A long, detailed section on precious, how you should detach from the world and how you should have nothing to do with the material and don't touch sensuality. What's going on? There are two opposing themes in Jewish writings. One is using the material as we've discussed at length. And the other one is precious, prishut. That means to detach from the world. How do you put these together? The answer is, couldn't be clearer. I heard it put this way by Rav Simcha Wasserman. He used to say, you are required to use the world fully. Where you perish, where you do precious, is you don't touch one drop of the world for its own sake. As soon as you engage the world for its own sake, you're lost. That's the precious we practice. We don't practice ascetic. We don't practice detachment from the world, from the things you need in the world. On the contrary, you should enjoy your sleep and your food and your wine and all the sensuality of the world. Enjoy it fully, as long as it's being used as a vehicle. The body's being used in service of the soul. The body should be taken care of and given full expression. But as soon as you use the body for the sake of the body, as soon as you use your mind to serve your body, then you're lost. And therefore, when we talk about precious, we mean, let me put it this way, you can feast on Purim if you can fast on Yom Kippur. And if you tell me you're feasting on Purim because you're being very spiritual, really? Let's see you fast with the same joy as you feast. And in other words, yeah, that's the training ground. And therefore, we practice separation from the world, meaning we separate from every second of time and every ounce of the material and every detail of sensuality that's not needed. That's Egypt. But as soon as you use the world only as much as necessary, fully and richly, and living it to the full, using it for what's necessary, you're sanctifying and unifying worlds. Okay, I hope this has been clear. This is a little bit about the concept of chipazon, which is leaving Egypt rapidly. We're not talking about rushing. We're talking about disciplining ourselves to use the world fully, but each aspect of the world used in a justified way, which means you're drinking the wine fully and enjoying it and getting high on the wine. And it's better to drink red wine, which is more din, but it has to be as much as is necessary. Less than that, you didn't fulfill the mitzvah and you rejected part of God's world. But more than that, you start using the world for its own sake and not for the sake of spirit. Thank you to Ariel and thank you to Bina. I wish everyone a wonderful Pesach, and a special wish that the world comes to its senses in the Middle East and every place else. Just a little common sense, getting the balance right between the material and the spiritual. And maybe this Pesach will be a step towards that. Have a great Pesach. Thanks to everyone.